My parents told me to stand behind a hedge during my own sister's wedding so I wouldn't ruin the family photos. Guests mistook me for hired help, and even my father texted me, "No one cares about your military career." I smiled, stayed silent, and prepared to leave without making a scene. But 20 minutes later, a convoy of black government SUVs rolled through the gates, and a Four-Star Admiral stepped out, looked across 200 wedding guests, and called my name. In that single moment, the family who spent my whole life trying to hide me could no longer hide the truth. The seating card had 200 names printed in gold. Mine wasn't one of them. I stood at the edge of my sister's wedding lawn, holding a place I technically wasn't supposed to occupy, watching my family's perfect day unfold without me in it. A man with a clipboard glanced at me and asked if I was with Catering. I didn't correct him. I just nodded, because correcting him would have meant admitting what my family had already decided years ago, that I didn't belong in the picture. Not today, not ever. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from my father. "No one cares about your career." I stared at it for a second longer than I should have. Then I locked the screen and put it away. He had no idea that in less than 2 hours, 300 people would stand up for that exact career, and the loudest wedding in the county would go completely silent. But I wasn't there yet. Not in that moment. Not in the part of the story where everything breaks open. I left my apartment before sunrise, 4 hours of driving ahead of me. No music, no calls, just silence. After deployments, silence doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels controlled, like something you can finally survive. I told myself this weekend would be simple. Show up, smile, leave before anything got complicated. That's what I always do. The Dalton estate appeared just after noon. White fences, perfect hedges trimmed into straight, arrogant lines. A wedding venue designed to look like nothing could ever go wrong inside it. Inside that perfection, I already knew my role. Not guest, not daughter, just useful. My mother met me at the door. She hugged me lightly, carefully, like I might wrinkle the image she had planned for today. Her eyes moved over my clothes. Civilian, plain, approved. She said, "You made it." Not, "I'm glad you're here." Just confirmation that I hadn't ruined her expectation. Inside, every wall was my sister. Photos of her laughing, dancing, existing effortlessly in the center of everything. There wasn't a single picture where I stood beside her. I wasn't missing from today. I was missing from the story. "I need you to help with setup," my father said as soon as he saw me. Not hello, not welcome, just direction. That was always his language with me. He shook hands with arriving guests, smiling wider with every wealthy name he recognized. Then he turned slightly toward me and said, "This is my daughter. She handles logistics." Logistics. 15 years in the Navy, reduced to a word you use for moving chairs. I smiled anyway, because that's what I've always done. Smile, adjust, disappear. And somewhere between carrying champagne trays and fixing seating cards, I became exactly what they needed me to be. Invisible enough to control, useful enough to keep around, but never important enough to see. I didn't know yet that invisibility has a limit, and mine was already close to breaking. Later, a guest mistook me for staff and asked for tonic water. Another asked me to fix Table 9's bread situation. No one questioned it, not once. That's the part that stayed with me. Not the insult, but how easily it fit, like the whole world had already agreed on who I was supposed to be. I was about to carry another tray when I felt my phone vibrate again. Another message from command. "Keep your phone on this weekend." No explanation. No context, just that. I stared at it longer this time, because in my world, messages like that don't come for weddings. They come for endings. And I had no idea yet which kind of ending this was going to be. Behind me, the music started tuning. Ahead of me, my family prepared for a perfect ceremony. And somewhere beyond the gates, something had already started moving toward us. Something my father would not be able to control. Something no seating chart could fix. And something I was not ready to face, even though deep down I already felt it coming. By 3 o'clock, every parking space on my parents' estate was filled. Luxury sedans, imported SUVs, country club members, business partners, local politicians, people my father had spent years impressing. To them, today wasn't just a wedding, it was an exhibition. A carefully staged performance where every flower, every smile, and every guest reflected the Dalton family's success. And like every performance, someone had to stay behind the curtain. That someone was me. Commander. I turned. It was the wedding coordinator. Young, nervous, holding a clipboard covered with handwritten notes. "I'm so sorry to bother you. You can just call me Evelyn." She smiled awkwardly. "I actually thought you worked for the caterers." I laughed softly. "You aren't the first." She relaxed. "Would you mind helping us move a few chairs before the ceremony starts?" I could have said no. I wasn't hired staff. I wasn't being paid. I was the bride's sister. Instead, "I'll take care of it." Old habits. Always useful, never difficult. For the next 40 minutes, I solved everyone else's problems. A missing extension cord, a broken centerpiece, a flower arrangement blown over by the wind, a crying flower girl, an elderly guest who couldn't find her seat. Nobody thanked me. Nobody asked if I'd eaten. Nobody even noticed. Except one person, my grandmother. Rosemary Dalton watched everything from the porch swing. At 83, age had slowed her legs, but never her eyes. As I carried another folding chair across the lawn, she called me over. "Evelyn." I sat beside her. She reached up and brushed an imaginary piece of lint from my shoulder. "You've always carried too much." I smiled. "It's only a few chairs." She shook her head. I wasn't talking about the chairs. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she squeezed my hand. "You know your grandfather would have been proud of you." My throat tightened. Grandpa William had been the only person in the family who ever understood why I joined the Navy. When everyone else worried about appearances, he worried about character. He'd passed away 6 years earlier. Sometimes I still caught myself reaching for the phone to call him after difficult days. Before I could answer, my mother's voice echoed across the lawn. "Evelyn, we need you." Of course they did. Inside the bridal suite, my sister Lauren stood in front of the mirror while 3 makeup artists circled around her. She looked beautiful, radiant, happy, the way every bride deserves to look. The moment she saw me, she smiled. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere." She hugged me tightly. Unlike our parents, Lauren's hugs were always genuine. She loved me. That was never the problem. The problem was, she never noticed what loving me actually cost. "Can you do me one favor?" "Of course. My train keeps catching on everything." "I knew you'd know how to fix it." I knelt on the floor, straightened every layer of fabric, pinned the lace exactly where it belonged, adjusted the veil. Lauren looked at herself in the mirror. "Perfect. I don't know what I'd do without you." Neither did I. Because every important moment in this family happened the same way. Lauren stood in the spotlight. I made the spotlight work. As I stood to leave, I noticed 4 bridesmaids laughing together by the window. For just a second, I wondered where I'd be standing during the ceremony. Surely, as the bride's only sister, I'd be beside her, right? My answer came less than 10 minutes later. The photographer walked into the room holding a seating chart. "Everyone in the wedding party, let's head outside." He began reading names. The maid of honor, 4 bridesmaids, 2 flower girls, the best man, groomsmen, parents, grandparents, everyone. He reached the end of the list. My name never came. I waited. Surely he'd forgotten. Instead, my mother walked over quietly. "Evelyn, we've made a small adjustment." "What adjustment?" She smiled the way people smile before delivering bad news. "The photographers look cleaner with fewer people." I stared at her. "I'm Lauren's sister." "I know, sweetheart, but you'll understand." There it was, the sentence I'd heard my entire life. "You'll understand. Your sister needs this more. You'll understand. Dad's under pressure. You'll understand. Don't make today about yourself. You'll understand." Every sacrifice I'd ever made began with those 2 words. "So where do you want me?" I asked. Mom looked relieved that I wasn't arguing. The photographer found the perfect solution. She pointed toward the tall hedges bordering the west lawn. You can stand just behind those hedges during the family photographs. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because I thought she'd misspoken. You want me behind the hedge? It's only for the pictures. The hedge will soften the background. Soften? She hesitated. It'll keep the composition balanced. Composition. That was the word she chose. Not daughter, not family. Composition. At that moment, I understood something that hurt more than being excluded. They weren't embarrassed by what I'd done. They were embarrassed by who I'd become. A Navy officer, independent, unavailable for their version of perfection. The ceremony ended beneath warm afternoon sunlight. Guests applauded as Lauren and Preston shared their first kiss. The photographer immediately called for family photographs. Everyone moved into position. My father directed people with the confidence of a movie producer. A little closer. Mom, step left. Lauren, beautiful, perfect. Then his eyes found me. Evelyn. He pointed toward the hedge. Right over there. I looked at him. Surely he realized how ridiculous this was. He didn't. He simply smiled. We don't want to crowd the frame. I slowly walked toward the hedge. Leaves brushed against my shoulder. From where I stood, I could still see my family. They just couldn't really see me. The photographer lifted his camera. Everyone smile. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated. I glanced down. A text message. From my father. He was standing less than 15 feet away, still smiling for the camera, still pretending to be the perfect father. The message contained only 8 words. Stay out of the pictures. Nobody cares about your career. For a long moment, the world became completely silent. The laughter, the music, the cameras, everything disappeared. I looked up at the family smiling beneath the golden afternoon sun. Then I looked down at the message one last time. 34 years. 34 years of trying to earn a place in this family, and in 8 words, my father erased every hope I'd been carrying since childhood. Something inside me didn't shatter. It simply stopped waiting. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, turned away from the photographs, and quietly walked toward the parking lot. I thought I was leaving the wedding. I didn't know that before I reached my car, 3 black government SUVs would turn through the front gates, and every lie my father had built his life around was about to collapse. I had almost reached my car when I heard tires crunch across the gravel driveway. At first, I ignored it. Luxury cars had been arriving all afternoon. Another guest, I assumed. Then the music stopped. Not faded, stopped. The string quartet lowered their instruments in the middle of a song. Conversations died one by one until an uneasy silence spread across the reception lawn. Curiosity pulled me back toward the estate. 3 black government SUVs rolled slowly through the front gates. No decorations, no wedding ribbons, just dark windows and small American flags mounted on the front fenders. Every guest turned to look. My father frowned. This has to be some kind of mistake. The vehicles came to a smooth stop in front of the ceremony lawn. The first driver's door opened. 2 Navy security officers stepped out. Not hurried, not aggressive, calm, professional. They scanned the area before opening the rear passenger door. A tall man in full-dress white uniform stepped onto the gravel. Rows of ribbons covered his chest. 4 silver stars rested on each shoulder. The afternoon sun reflected off the gold trim of his cap. Even guests who knew nothing about the military understood one thing. Whoever this man was, he carried extraordinary authority. Whispers spread through the crowd. Is that a general? No, I think he's Navy. Why would someone like that be here? My father straightened his suit jacket. A smile slowly returned to his face. He glanced proudly toward his business partners. This must be for Judge Harrison, he whispered. He mentioned someone important might stop by. Without waiting, my father walked confidently toward the arriving officer. His hand was already extended. Admiral, welcome to the Dalton estate. I'm Richard Dalton. It's an honor to have you at my daughter's wedding. The officer looked at the offered hand. He didn't take it. Instead, his eyes calmly moved past my father, searching, studying every face in the crowd. My father laughed awkwardly. "I'm sure you're looking for the bride." He gestured proudly toward Lauren. "My daughter just got married." Still, no response. The Admiral removed a folded photograph from a leather portfolio. He looked at it briefly, then looked back across the crowd. His expression sharpened. One of the security officers leaned closer. "Sir, I believe she's near the parking area." The Admiral nodded once. Then, without another glance at my father, he walked straight past him. Guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a path. My father stood frozen, his outstretched hand still hanging in the air. Confusion spread across the lawn. Who is he looking for? Did something happen? Is someone in trouble? I was standing near the edge of the driveway when our eyes finally met. Recognition appeared instantly. The Admiral's posture became even straighter. He closed the remaining distance between us. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. Then something happened that no one there expected. The Four-Star Admiral came to attention. His white-gloved hand rose sharply to the brim of his cap. He rendered a perfect military salute. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in a clear, commanding voice that carried across the silent estate. "Commander Evelyn Dalton, it is an honor." Every conversation stopped. Every camera turned. My breath caught. Instinct took over. I returned the salute with crisp precision. "Good afternoon, Admiral." The guests stared between us in complete disbelief. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the stone walkway. Nobody reacted. They couldn't. My father looked as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. "What? What is this?" The Admiral lowered his salute. He smiled. "Commander, I apologize for arriving during your family celebration. I understand the timing is less than ideal." I answered quietly. "Sir, I wasn't informed anyone was coming." That was intentional. He glanced briefly toward the crowd before looking back at me. Certain recognitions deserve to be delivered in person. Behind him, another officer stepped forward carrying a polished wooden presentation case. Guests stretched their necks trying to see inside. The Admiral accepted the case, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he turned toward the assembled guests. "I understand many of you may not know Commander Dalton." A nervous laugh escaped someone near the reception tent. The Admiral continued, "For the past few years, she has served our nation with exceptional courage, leadership, and integrity. Because much of her work has remained classified, she has received little public recognition." He paused. "Today," I saw my mother's face lose its color. She looked from the Admiral to me, then toward my father as though expecting him to explain everything. He couldn't, because he didn't know. He had never asked. The Admiral opened the presentation case. Inside rested a dark blue folder embossed with the seal of the Department of the Navy. He held it carefully. "Commander Evelyn Dalton, by direction of the Secretary of the Navy, I have the privilege of presenting official orders recognizing your distinguished service and informing you of your selection for one of the Navy's highest leadership appointments." A wave of whispers swept through the crowd. Business executives, politicians, neighbors, everyone who'd ignored me an hour ago suddenly watched as though history were unfolding before them. The Admiral smiled again. But before I read those orders, he glanced toward the family photographs still arranged by the hedge. "I have one question." His voice remained calm, yet somehow it carried even more weight than before. Why was one of the United States Navy's finest officers standing alone behind a hedge at her own sister's wedding? Silence. Absolute silence. No one answered. Not my mother, not my sister, and certainly not my father. For the first time in my life, Richard Dalton had nothing to say, and deep inside, I realized something unexpected. This wasn't the moment I dreamed about as a little girl. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry. I simply felt seen. For the first time in my life, someone with nothing to gain had looked at me not as the forgotten daughter, not as the quiet helper, not as the woman carrying trays, but as the officer I had spent 15 years becoming. I had no idea that what the Admiral was about to reveal next would shake my family even more than the salute itself and force my father to confront a truth he had spent years refusing to see. The silence lingered so long that even the wind seemed to stop. More than 300 guests stood motionless, waiting for someone, anyone, to answer the Admiral's question. No one did. My father opened his mouth once, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, Richard Dalton couldn't control the room. The Four-Star Admiral looked around slowly, his calm expression never changing. "I'll ask one more time." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Why was Commander Evelyn Dalton standing behind a hedge instead of beside her family? Every eye turned toward my parents. My mother's hands trembled as she gripped the bouquet she had been carrying for the photographs. It was only for the pictures," she forced a weak smile. "The photographer thought it would look cleaner." A ripple of disbelief spread across the crowd. One of the guests whispered just loudly enough for others to hear. They hid their own daughter for a photograph? Another guest shook his head. "I thought she worked for the caterers." The words hit my father like a punch, because that was exactly what everyone had believed. The Admiral looked toward me. "Commander, is that accurate?" I could have humiliated my parents. I could have repeated every cruel word, every forgotten birthday, every deployment they ignored, every award they never asked about. Instead, I answered honestly. My parents believed I would distract from my sister's day. The Admiral studied my face for a long moment. I see. He understood far more than my words revealed. He opened the blue folder in his hands. "Commander Evelyn Dalton, for exceptional leadership, extraordinary service, and unwavering dedication to the United States Navy, you have been selected to assume command of Naval Strategic Readiness Group 7, effective upon completion of your current assignment." Gasps echoed across the reception lawn. Several veterans among the guests exchanged stunned looks. They understood exactly what that appointment meant. It wasn't just another promotion, it was one of the Navy's most prestigious command positions. The Admiral continued, "In 15 years of service, Commander Dalton has led sailors through humanitarian operations, crisis response missions, and multiple overseas deployments. She has received the Navy's highest recommendations for leadership while asking for recognition exactly 0 times." He smiled. "That combination is rare." He handed me the appointment orders. I accepted them with both hands. "Thank you, Admiral." "No, Commander," he replied warmly. "Thank you." The guests erupted in applause. Not polite applause, real applause. The kind that builds naturally when people witness something genuine. People who hadn't spoken to me all afternoon suddenly stood. Some even wiped tears from their eyes. Across the lawn, the catering staff, the very people everyone had mistaken me for, began clapping first. Then the veterans joined them. Then everyone else. The only people who didn't move were my parents. Lauren slowly walked toward me. Her wedding dress swept softly across the grass. Tears filled her eyes. "Evelyn, I'm so sorry." I looked at her quietly. "For what?" She swallowed hard. "I never noticed. I thought Mom and Dad treated us differently because I was younger. I didn't realize." Her voice broke. "I didn't realize they erased you." For years, I'd wanted my sister to understand. Now that she finally did, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief. I stepped forward and hugged her. "This isn't your fault," she cried into my shoulder. "I should have seen it. You were never supposed to carry that responsibility." A voice interrupted us. "Dad?" Lauren turned. Richard Dalton stood only a few feet away. His confidence had vanished. His expensive suit suddenly looked too large. His shoulders sagged under a weight no one else could see. He looked at me for several seconds before speaking. "Evelyn, The words refused to come. For decades, he'd always known exactly what to say. Today, Nothing fit. Finally, he whispered, "I thought I was protecting this family." I met his eyes. "No, you were protecting your image." His face collapsed because he knew it was true. Every decision, every comparison, every excuse, every time he asked me to understand, it had never been about family. It had been about appearances. The Admiral stepped beside us. "Mr. Dalton." My father looked up slowly. "I've served with your daughter for many years. Do you know what sailors say about Commander Dalton?" Dad shook his head. "They say she'd be the first person through the door in a crisis, and the last person to take credit afterwards." He paused. "They trust her with their lives." Another pause. And yet, today, his eyes drifted toward the hedge. The people who should have trusted her most couldn't even trust her with a family photograph. Those words landed harder than any accusation. My father lowered his head. For the first time in anyone's memory, Richard Dalton looked ashamed. Not embarrassed, ashamed. The photographer slowly approached. He held his camera awkwardly. "Excuse me." Everyone looked at him. "I know this probably isn't my place, but I think today's family portrait should be taken again." No one argued. The wedding party gathered once more. This time, no one told me where to stand. I remained where I was, near the edge of the lawn. Old habits die slowly. Then Lauren reached for my hand. "No." She smiled through her tears. "You belong here." She gently pulled me to the center of the family, beside her, exactly where I should have been all along. The photographer lifted his camera. "Everyone ready?" Before taking the picture, he lowered the camera again. "Commander." I looked at him. "Would you mind standing just a little closer?" I smiled. "For the composition?" The guests laughed softly. Even the Admiral smiled. I stepped closer to my sister. The shutter clicked. For the first time in 35 years, there was a family photograph with every member of the family finally visible. But as I looked at my father, I realized something important. A photograph can capture a moment. It cannot erase a lifetime. And before this day was over, he still had one final choice to make. The camera shutter clicked one last time. For everyone else, it was just another wedding photograph. For me, it was the first picture in 35 years where no one had asked me to disappear. The photographer lowered his camera with a satisfied smile. Perfect. I looked at the image on the small display screen. Lauren stood beside me, still holding my hand. My grandmother smiled proudly from the front row. The Admiral stood respectfully off to one side, refusing to make himself the center of someone else's family memory. And my parents? They were there too, but something had changed. For the first time in my life, they weren't controlling the picture. The truth was, the reception resumed slowly. Conversations returned in cautious whispers. People no longer talked about the wedding. They talked about me. I had no idea. She's been a commander all these years? Did you hear what the Admiral said? I thought she worked for the caterers. One by one, guests approached. Some wanted to shake my hand. Others simply thanked me for my service. A retired Marine colonel introduced himself and said quietly, "I've spent 30 years in uniform. I've never seen a four-star admiral leave a command conference for something that wasn't important." I smiled politely. "It wasn't about me," he chuckled. "That's exactly why they chose you." Meanwhile, my father sat alone at an empty table. The confident attorney who had spent decades commanding every room now stared silently into a glass of untouched champagne. Business partners passed by. None of them stopped. For years, he had measured success by reputation. Today, reputation had abandoned him, not because of anything I said, because of everything he had done. As the evening sunlight settled over the estate, my grandmother found him sitting alone. She lowered herself carefully into the chair across from him. "I warned you." My father looked up slowly. "I know. When Evelyn enlisted, you called her selfish. When she became an officer, you called it a phase. When she deployed, you complained she missed holidays." Grandmother's eyes never left his. "Tell me, Richard, exactly what did she have to do before you were willing to see her? He had no answer, only silence. She sighed softly. You spent 35 years trying to shape one daughter into the woman you wanted, while ignoring the remarkable woman standing in front of you. Then she stood, and today, the entire country sent someone to remind you. She walked away before he could respond. A few minutes later, my father approached me, not as a successful lawyer, not as the head of the Dalton family, just a tired man. Evelyn, I turned. He looked older than he had that morning. I'm sorry. The words came quietly. I know. He blinked in surprise. You know? I've been waiting to hear those words since I was 12. His shoulders fell. I don't expect forgiveness. You shouldn't. The honesty seemed to hurt him more than anger would have. I missed too much. Yes, I can't change it. No. He nodded slowly. I spent my whole life worrying about how this family looked. He glanced toward the hedge. I never realized I was destroying how it felt. For the first time, I believed him, not because he deserved forgiveness, because regret had finally replaced pride. My mother joined us. Tears streamed down her face. I should have protected you. I looked at her gently. You were my mother. I know. I was afraid of disappointing your father, and instead, you disappointed yourself. She closed her eyes. I did. There was nothing else to say. Some truths don't need arguments. They only need acceptance. Lauren walked over carrying 2 slices of wedding cake. She handed one to me. You still hate strawberry frosting? I laughed. You remembered? She smiled. I remember more than you think. For the first time all day, we simply stood together, not as the favorite daughter, not as the forgotten daughter, just sisters. As sunset painted the sky in shades of gold, the Admiral prepared to leave. Before stepping into his vehicle, he stopped beside me. Commander, sir. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. It contained only one sentence. Never let anyone else's opinion become smaller than your own service. There was no signature. It didn't need to be. I folded the note carefully and placed it inside my jacket. I'll remember. I know you will. He smiled, saluted once more, and stepped into the SUV. The convoy disappeared through the front gates. This time, no one looked away. 6 months later, I officially assumed command of Naval Strategic Readiness Group 7. Hundreds of sailors stood in formation as I accepted the responsibilities of command. Among the invited guests sat 3 familiar faces, Lauren, my grandmother, and my father. When the ceremony ended, he waited quietly until everyone else had left. I brought something. He handed me an old wooden picture frame. Inside was the family photograph from the wedding, the one where I stood beside everyone else. But the frame had been engraved with a single sentence. Our family was never complete until we stopped hiding our strongest daughter. I looked at him. He smiled sadly. I keep the original in my office. So every day, I remember the cost of confusing success with love. For the first time in my life, I hugged my father because I wanted to, not because I hoped it would earn his approval. Some wounds never disappear. They become part of who we are. But healing doesn't begin when someone finally sees your worth. It begins the moment you stop asking people who refuse to see it in the first place. As I walked toward the waiting sailors, I realized something that years of service had quietly taught me. Family isn't defined by the people who share your name. It's defined by the people who stand beside you when the world asks who you are. That afternoon, I wasn't remembered because a 4-star admiral saluted me. I was remembered because I finally stood where I had always belonged, not behind a hedge, not carrying someone else's tray, but in the full light of the life I had earned. And for the first time, I never looked back.